So there's been a lot of discussion in the discussion board over the difference between myth, legend, and fairy tale. And just like the definition of myth itself, there's a million different opinions, a million different theories. There's no one right answer. Excuse me, I have a cold, so I put off recording this lecture as long as I could, but um, I'm going to do my best. And I apologize for sounding all stuffy. This is how I like to keep these terms straight in my mind. And it goes back to this idea that we've been talking about from the beginning, that myth is a sacred story told as true. And each element in that definition is important in the definition, in the distinction of what a myth is as opposed to something else, another narrative. And myths, legends, and fairy tales are all narratives, right? They're all stories. So I think of this in terms of an hourglass. And what we have here is a distinction made between mythological time and our time, or ordinary time, or the mundane world, the way we live right now. Myths take place in another existence, in another set of rules, right? This is this idea of the numinous. It's not of this world, it's transcendent, it's ecstatic, it's outside of ordinary time. So it's outside of our time, it's in another time. The ancient Greeks used to talk about myths as taking place in the time when gods walked with man. And that's not now. It's another time. It's a time when things were different, when the world was not as it is today. And that's why you have this point of creation right here. The point of creation isn't the creation of the world necessarily. It's the creation of the world as we know it. At the point where all of the natural rules, all of the things that make our world solid and real and predictable are in place. The sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Night follows day. People grow old and die. All of these things that happen in our natural world are set at this point. Myths happen before that is the case. In fact, myths oftentimes explain how those things came into being. A really short myth that I know of, it's a coyote myth. Coyote is a trickster. We'll talk more about what that means later in the class, but tricksters often break the rules. That's why they're mythological creatures, because they exist in a state in which the rules can be broken. But Coyote wanted this is a West Coast Indian tale, that Coyote wanted a monument to himself. And so he demanded this of the creator, who said, okay, the next morning when you wake up, there'll be a monument to you. So he wakes up the next morning and he sees nothing different. And he's kind of irritated by this, but he's waking up and he has to pee. So he pees and poof, a coyote bush leaps to existence right under his hind legs, right where he peed. And he thought that was odd, but remember, this is mythological time. This is a time when that kind of thing might happen. So it, he doesn't think that much of it. But a little while later, it happens again. Wherever he pees, a coyote bush jumps up. And the sort of point of the story is that's how we got coyote bushes, which you find everywhere in California. It's kind of a weed. And it's a joke on Coyote because his monument is this scrubby weed bush that appears anywhere he's peed on the ground. But the point of this story is that this myth takes place in a time when that's possible, when new plants can just appear because of a, magical coyote urine. That doesn't happen in our time. It doesn't happen today, but it could happen then. So stories in which that sort of thing can happen are myths. True stories that take place in our time, we can categorize as legend. And so that's the difference. That's that sacred element, right? Myths are sacred. Sacred is tied to the numinous, time tied to a time and a place when the natural world just doesn't work the way our world does. Legends are tied to our time and place. And the heroes of legend are humans, or maybe semi-divine, but that's the distinction. If it's tied to a particular time and place in our own history, you can call it a legend. If it has that connection to something other, a different set of laws, right, of natural laws, or when the natural laws of our world don't take precedence, or can't be applied, that's a myth. That's mythological time. And now, what about fairy tales? Well, they're way over here, right? See if I can write this. Fairy tales don't take place in real time at all. They are fiction. Everyone recognizes a fairy tale as fiction. And you often have what's called an opening formula, which lets people know, lets your listeners know that the story I'm about to tell, you're not supposed to believe. Nobody believes this to be true. This is fiction. Opening formula we're all most familiar with, once upon a time. If someone starts out a story, once upon a time, you already know how to consider this story, how to treat this story. It'd be really weird if you turned on the news and the newscaster said, well, once upon a time, there was an accident out on 69 East. That just doesn't compute, because once upon a time equals fiction. And of course, news is supposed to be fact. And there's lots of opening formulas. You find this around the world. One of my favorites is a Russian formula, not in your time and not in my time, but in somebody's time, and then the story goes on. So fairy tales are completely separate from myth and legend because they are considered fiction. They're recognized as fiction. Both legends and myths are told as true, to be believed, as things that actually happened. But legends happen in our own history. A lot of times this is considered to be a progression, right? So, here's the present that we're living in now. Excuse my writing here. This is the past. And of course the future is down here somewhere. And so myth is further in the past. It's beyond all legend. It's this ancient time. This is not actually the case in all cultures. For example, in Australian Aboriginal mythological belief, myth and everyday reality are actually laid on top of each other. They exist simultaneously, and you can move back and forth between the dream time, which is this mythological time, and ordinary existence at will, if you know how to do it, if you're a shaman. But in Western society, mythological occurrences, when they are told as true, are usually told as being very far in the past, further back than recorded history. That's why they're usually told orally, right? And they may be written down at a certain point, but they're written down here somewhere in real time about this earlier time. So that's one way to distinguish between myth, legend, and fairy tale. Like I said, there's lots of other schema that are used to try to make this distinction, but this is the one that makes sense for me. It's the one that I will be referring to throughout the class. So it's a place for you to start.